Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you knew about love, leaving you with nothing but the hard truth of what it takes to survive. For Eliza McGraw, standing alone on her failing homestead in 1870s New Mexico, that truth was simple. She needed help, and she wasn't too proud to ask for it. When Daniel Hart, a broken cowboy with empty pockets, wandered onto her land, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She looked him straight in the eye and made him an offer most folks would call crazy. "I need a husband, and you need strong. Our children," she declared, laying out a bargain built on necessity, not romance. What started as a deal between two desperate people slowly became something neither expected. But could two hearts scarred by loss find real love in the unforgiving wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The weathered homestead deed lay folded in Eliza McGraw's apron pocket, its edges worn smooth from years of anxious handling. She'd pulled it out 3 times that morning, reading the faded ink that proclaimed her legal right to these 40 acres of red New Mexico earth. The paper meant everything and nothing. Everything because it was all she had left of her dreams. Nothing because dreams don't pay debts or mend fences. Standing on her front porch in the early morning light, Eliza surveyed what remained of the McGraw homestead. The barn leaned precariously to the east, its roof patched with scraps of tin that caught the sunrise like broken mirrors. The vegetable garden, once her pride, had withered to stubble after 3 years of drought. Even the well, which had run sweet and deep when she and Thomas first settled here, now grudgingly offered up brackish water that made the livestock sick. At 38, Eliza had learned that life had a way of testing a person's resolve. She'd buried her husband of 15 years to consumption, watched her only child follow him 6 months later to the same disease, and somehow kept breathing when breathing felt like betrayal. That was 2 years ago. Since then, she'd watched their savings dwindle to nothing, seen neighbors abandon their claims and head back east, and felt the weight of loneliness settle into her bones like winter cold. But Eliza McGraw wasn't built for surrender. Her father had been a stubborn German immigrant who'd carved a farm from Pennsylvania rock, and her mother had been an Irish woman who could stretch a penny until it screamed. That combination of determination and practicality ran in her blood, like a river that refused to change course. Daniel Hart had stumbled onto her property 3 days ago, leading a lame horse and looking like a man who'd lost a fight with the world. His clothes were patched and travel-worn, his boots split at the seams, and his hat had seen better decades. But his hands, Eliza had noticed his hands immediately. They were working hands, calloused and capable, the kind that knew their way. Around tools and livestock and hard labor, he'd ask for water for his horse and work for food, nothing more. Most drifters who passed through these parts were running from something, debts, the law, or memories they couldn't bear. Daniel seemed to be running from all 3, but there was something different about him. He didn't have the shifty eyes of a man with violence in his past, or the nervous energy of someone expecting trouble to catch up. Instead, he carried himself like a soldier who'd simply forgotten how to stand at attention. That first night, she'd let him sleep in the barn. The second night, too. On the 3rd morning, watching him gentle her temperamental mare while shoeing her properly for the first time in months, Eliza made her decision. "Daniel Hart," she called from the porch, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd learned to make hard choices. He looked up from the horse's hoof, his brown eyes cautious but respectful. "Yes, ma'am. How long since you've had a proper meal? And I mean proper. Not rabbit you caught yourself or beans from." "A can?" He straightened slowly, considering his answer. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Been living rough since I left Colorado." Eliza nodded. She'd suspected as much. The man was too thin, his cheeks hollow despite the strength in his frame. "And how long since you've had steady work? The kind that comes With a roof and regular wages, this time his hesitation lasted longer, 6 months give or take. Lost my job at the Broken Arrow Ranch when the owner sold to developers. Most spreads around here aren't hiring drifters. I see. Eliza stepped down from the porch, her worn boots crunching on the packed earth. She studied Daniel's face in the morning light, taking in the premature lines around his eyes and the careful way he held himself, as if he was used to disappointment. "How old are you, Daniel?" 34, ma'am. "You ever been married?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His eyes flickered with something, pain maybe, or regret. "No, ma'am. Came close once, but things didn't work out." Eliza reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the homestead deed, unfolding it carefully. "This piece of paper says I own 40 acres of decent grazing land with water rights to Willow Creek. It also says I own a barn, a house, and enough debt to choke a horse." She refolded the document and tucked it away. "What it doesn't say is that I'm too proud to admit I can't manage it alone." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure where this conversation was heading. "Ma'am, if you're looking to hire help, I should tell you straight. I don't have references you can check. Haven't been in one place long enough to earn them. I'm not looking to hire help, Daniel. I'm looking for something more permanent." Eliza met his eyes directly, the way she'd learned to do when life required difficult conversations. "I need a husband, and you need strong children." The words hung in the morning air between them like a challenge. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He glanced around the homestead as if looking for an escape route, or perhaps checking to see if someone else had heard this impossible proposition. "Ma'am, before you answer, let me explain what I'm offering." Eliza's tone remained businesslike, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "This isn't about romance or feelings or any of the nonsense young folks chase after. This is about survival. I've got land, but no help to work it. You've got skills, but no place to use them. Seems to me we could both benefit from a practical arrangement." Daniel removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, now clearly speechless. Eliza pressed on, knowing that hesitation would only give doubt time to take root. "The way I see it, we could make this work for both of us. You'd have a home, steady work, and your name on the deed. I'd have the help I need to keep this place running and maybe even turn it profitable again. Neither of us would be alone anymore, which counts for something out here where the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away." "Mrs. McGraw," Daniel began carefully, "that's a mighty generous offer, but I don't know anything about being a husband. Never had the chance to learn. Neither did Thomas when I married him," Eliza replied. "We figured it out together, and it worked well enough for 15 years. The way I see it, marriage is mostly about 2 people pulling in the same direction, instead of against each other." Daniel looked out across the struggling homestead, and Eliza could see him calculating the work that needed doing, the potential in the land, the simple human need for belonging that she recognized because it matched her own. "What about children?" he asked quietly. "You mentioned strong children." Eliza felt her throat tighten at the question, but she kept her voice steady. "I lost my boy 2 years ago. Always wanted more, but Thomas and I never were blessed that way. I'm 38, Daniel. Not too old, but not young either. Time's not on my side for starting a family." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind through the canyon and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Daniel spoke. "This arrangement, what exactly would it involve?" Eliza had anticipated this question. "A legal marriage, properly witnessed in town. You take the McGraw name to make the claim stronger. We'd work this land together, share the profits when there are any, and build something that would last." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "As for the rest, well, that would develop naturally or it wouldn't. No expectations either way." Daniel studied her face for a long moment, and Eliza wondered what he saw there. Desperation, determination, the kind of practical strength that had kept her going when grief tried to knock her down. "Can I think on it?" he asked finally. "Of course." But not too long. Winter's coming, and we've got work to do if we're going to be ready for it. That conversation had taken place yesterday. This morning, Eliza stood on her porch again, watching Daniel work with the horses and wondering if she'd made a fool of herself. The practical part of her mind insisted the offer made sense. The lonely part whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was asking for more than either of them could give. But as she watched Daniel's patient, gentle way with the animals, saw how he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his trade, Eliza felt something stir in her chest that had been dormant for too long. Not love, she wasn't naive enough to call it that, but possibility. The chance that two damaged people might find a way to heal together, even if they started from necessity, rather than affection. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. 3 riders were coming up the dusty track that led to her front gate, and Eliza recognized them with a sinking heart. Marcus Blackwood rode in the center, his 2 hired hands flanking him like bookends. The Blackwood Ranch controlled most of the water rights in this valley, and Marcus had made no secret of his desire to expand his holdings. Eliza straightened her shoulders and stepped down from the porch to meet them. Whatever Marcus wanted, it wouldn't be good news for a struggling widow trying to hold on to her land. The burned fence post stood like a blackened finger, pointing accusingly at the morning sky. Daniel crouched beside it, running his calloused fingers over the charred wood, while Eliza stood nearby, her face hard as the canyon walls that surrounded their property. "They didn't even try to hide it," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, soaked it in coal oil and lit it up like a bonfire. "Wanted to make sure we'd see what they'd done." Daniel stood slowly, brushing ash from his hands. 3 sections of fence had been destroyed overnight, creating a gap wide enough for cattle to wander through. But that wasn't the worst of it. Beyond the ruined fencing, 6 of Eliza's longhorn cattle lay motionless in the morning grass, their bodies already stiff with death. "The water," Daniel said grimly. "They poisoned the water." Eliza nodded, her jaw clenched so tight he could see the muscle jumping beneath her skin. "Willow Creek runs clear up from the mountains. Whatever they dumped in it got carried downstream to my waterholes. My cattle drank it, and now they're dead." Daniel had seen plenty of range wars during his years as a cowhand, but this felt different. This wasn't about grazing rights or water access. This was about driving a woman off her land through sheer intimidation, the kind of tactics that made his stomach turn and his fists clench involuntarily. "How long has Blackwood been pressuring you?" he asked. "Since Thomas died," Eliza replied, staring at her dead cattle. "Started with friendly offers to buy me out. When I said no, the offers got less friendly. Last month he told me straight that a woman had no business trying to run a ranch alone." Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd given Eliza his answer to her proposition that morning, agreeing to the arrangement with a handshake, and a promise to make it legal in town by week's end. Now it seemed like that decision might have been made just in time. "Any chance this was random?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Eliza pointed to the ground near the burned fence. "Post." Even Daniel could read the message carved into the dirt with a knife or stick. "Last warning, sell out or get out." "Marcus Blackwood's got himself a mean streak that runs deeper than most," Eliza continued. "His daddy built that ranch by pushing out smaller spreads, and Marcus seems determined to finish the job. Problem is, I'm not some greenhorn who'll spook. At the first sign of trouble." Daniel walked over to examine the dead cattle more closely. The animals hadn't died easy. Their mouths were foam-flecked, and their legs were drawn up in the final agony of poisoning. Someone had used lye or perhaps arsenic, dumping enough into the creek to kill anything that drank from it downstream. "This isn't just intimidation," Daniel said, his voice harder than Eliza had heard it before. "This is attempted murder. If you'd been watering your horses downstream instead of at the well, you'd be burying more than cattle this morning." The words hung between them like a challenge. Eliza studied Daniel's face, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there before. The easygoing drifter who'd stumbled onto her property was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd seen his share of violent trouble and wasn't afraid of seeing more. "You don't have to stay for this," she said quietly. "Our arrangement doesn't require you to fight someone else's war." Daniel turned to face her fully, his brown eyes steady and determined. "Mrs. McGraw, Eliza, if we're going to be married, then your fights are my fights. That's what partnership means." Something shifted in Eliza's chest at his words. Not love. Not yet, but recognition. She'd chosen well when she'd offered this arrangement to Daniel Hart. Whatever his past held, whatever had driven him to her doorstep with nothing but a lame horse and empty pockets, he wasn't the kind of man who ran from trouble. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. Daniel looked around the destroyed fencing, then toward the creek, where the poisoned water still ran red with whatever chemical had been dumped upstream. "First, we clean up this mess and bury the cattle before they start drawing scavengers. Then we ride into town and file a report with the sheriff. Sheriff Patterson's in Marcus Blackwood's pocket," Eliza said bitterly. "Has been since Blackwood helped finance his last election." "Maybe so, but we still need to get this on record. When this escalates, and it will, we want to be able to prove we tried to handle it legal first." Eliza nodded slowly. Daniel was right, though she doubted the law would be much help when push came to shove. In these parts, justice usually came down to who had the most men and the most guns, and Marcus Blackwood had plenty of both. They spent the rest of the morning cleaning up the damage and digging graves for the poisoned cattle. It was grim, backbreaking. Work made worse by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. By noon, they were both filthy and exhausted, but the immediate cleanup was done. "We should head into town," Daniel said, washing the grave dirt from his hands at the well. "Get this reported and pick up supplies while we're there. Something tells me we're going to need to stock up on more than just food and ammunition." Eliza changed into her town dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better years but was still presentable for conducting business. Daniel cleaned up as best he could and put on his least patched shirt. They made an unlikely pair, a desperate widow and a down-on-his-luck drifter preparing to take on one of the most powerful ranches in New Mexico territory. The ride into Tres Piedras took them past 2 other abandoned homesteads. They're empty, windows staring like dead eyes across the grassland. Eliza pointed them out as they rode. "The Hendersons left last spring after their well mysteriously dried up," she said. "The Kowalskis pulled out in June after their barn burned down with their winter feed inside." "All neighbors of yours?" Daniel asked. "All had water rights that Blackwood wanted." Eliza's voice was matter-of-fact, but Daniel could hear the anger underneath. "Funny how much bad luck small homesteaders have been having lately. Tres Piedras wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road, but it served the scattered ranches and homesteads for 50 miles in every direction. The sheriff's office occupied a single room next to the general store, and Sheriff Patterson looked up from his desk with obvious reluctance when Eliza and Daniel walked in. "Afternoon, Mrs. McGraw," Patterson said, his tone carefully neutral. "What brings you to town?" "6 dead cattle and destroyed property," Eliza replied without preamble. "Someone poisoned Willow Creek upstream from my place and burned out 3 sections of fence." Patterson leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "That's serious accusations, ma'am. You got any proof it was deliberate?" Daniel stepped forward and placed the carved message they'd copied from the dirt onto Patterson's desk. "This was left at the scene." The sheriff barely glanced at the paper. "Could have been left by anyone. Maybe some drunk cowboy playing a prank." "A prank that killed 6 head of cattle." Eliza's voice rose slightly. "Sheriff, I know you've got loyalties in this county, but I'm asking you to do your job." Patterson's face flushed red. "I don't appreciate accusations, Mrs. McGraw, and I don't appreciate strangers coming into my office making demands." He looked pointedly at Daniel. "Don't believe we've been introduced." "Daniel Hart," Daniel said evenly. "Mrs. McGraw's fiancé." The word hung in the air like a bomb. Patterson's eyebrows shot up, and Eliza felt a flutter of surprise at hearing their arrangement described so plainly. "Fiancé?" Patterson repeated. "That's mighty sudden, isn't it?" "Not sudden enough, apparently," Daniel replied. "If we'd been married already, maybe whoever did this would have thought twice about targeting a woman living alone." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Patterson heard it and didn't like it one bit. "I'll look into your complaint, Mrs. McGraw," he said stiffly, "but I can't promise much without more evidence." They left the sheriff's office knowing they'd accomplished little except putting their marriage plans on the public record. But as they walked to the general store to buy supplies, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Whatever came next, she'd have someone standing beside her who wouldn't back down from a fight. Daniel's broken spurs lay on the kitchen table like a confession of better days. The leather straps were cracked and mended with wire, the rowels bent from too many hard landings, and the silver inlay, once his pride, was tarnished beyond recognition. Eliza picked up one of the spurs, feeling its weight in her palm. "These were fine once," she observed, running her finger along the damaged metalwork. Daniel looked up from the ledger where he'd been recording their supply purchases. "My father's. He rode for the cavalry in the Mexican War, earned those spurs in a fight at Buena Vista. I've been meaning to get them repaired, but—" He shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes about priorities when you're down to your last dollar. "But you've had more pressing concerns," Eliza finished. She set the spur down carefully, understanding that she was holding more than damaged equipment. These spurs represented Daniel's connection to something better than his current circumstances, a reminder of skills and heritage that poverty hadn't yet erased. 3 days had passed since their confrontation with Sheriff Patterson in town. 3 days of working side by side, learning each other's rhythms and capabilities. Daniel had proven himself more valuable than Eliza had dared hope. He understood cattle in a way that only came from years of experience, could read weather patterns like scripture, and had a gentle but firm hand with her temperamental mare, Rosa. "You never told me you'd worked cavalry horses," Eliza said, settling into the chair across from him. Daniel's hand moved unconsciously to the spurs. "Different lifetime. Before I took to drifting." What changed? The question hung between them, part of the careful dance they'd been doing around each other's painful histories. They were engaged to be married, sharing meals and planning a future together, but still stepping cautiously around the wounds that had brought them both to this point. "War ended," Daniel said finally. "Came home to find my family's farm had been sold for taxes. My younger sister had died of influenza while I was gone, and my parents hadn't been able to keep up with the payments." He closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. "Spent the next 10 years trying to build something new, always seeming to fall just short. Finally gave up trying and started moving." Eliza nodded, recognizing the familiar pattern of loss and displacement that seemed to define so many lives in this harsh territory. "I'm sorry about your sister. Mary Beth, she was only 16. Daniel's voice softened. "Used to follow me around when I was breaking horses, asking questions about everything. Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn. She sounds like she would have gotten along well with you." Daniel smiled, the first genuine smile Eliza had seen from him. "She'd have liked you too. Mary Beth had no patience for fools or frilly nonsense. She'd have appreciated your direct approach to problem solving." The compliment warmed Eliza more than she'd expected. They were finding their way toward something that felt like friendship, built on mutual respect and shared circumstances. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was comfortable in a way that surprised her. "Speaking of problem solving," she said, "we need to talk about sleeping arrangements." Daniel's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. This was the conversation they'd been avoiding, the practical reality of their upcoming marriage that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with propriety. "I've been thinking about that," he said carefully. "The barn's comfortable enough for now. No need to rush into anything that might make either of us uncomfortable." Eliza appreciated his consideration, but she'd been thinking practically about their situation. Daniel, we're supposed to be married in 4 days. People are going to expect us to act like husband and wife, not like boarders sharing a house. What are you suggesting? The house has 2 bedrooms. Thomas and I used the larger one, but the smaller room has a good bed and its own window. You could take that one at least until we figure out how this arrangement is really going to work. Daniel nodded slowly. That seems reasonable, and Eliza, I want you to know I won't expect anything beyond what you're comfortable with. This marriage is about partnership, not the other things marriage usually involves. I appreciate that. Eliza found herself studying his face, noting the way worry lines creased the corners of his eyes, and how his mouth held the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned not to expect too much from life. But Daniel, we should probably discuss the possibility that this arrangement might become more than just practical. The words hung in the air between them, acknowledged but not examined too closely. Neither of them was ready for that conversation. Yet, we'll take it as it comes, Daniel said finally. No pressure either way. That afternoon they worked together to repair the fence line that had been destroyed 3 nights earlier. Daniel's skill with tools impressed Eliza. His movements were efficient and precise, the work of a man who'd spent years building and fixing things with his own hands. "You're handy with that hammer," she commented, watching him drive a fence. "And post into the hard ground." "Had to be. When you're working different ranches every few months, you learn to fix what breaks or find yourself out of work." Daniel paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. "These posts should hold better than the original ones. Pine's not the strongest wood for fencing, but it's what we've got to work with." "Pine's what Thomas used, too. Said it was good enough if you treated it right. Your husband sounds like he was a practical man." "He was." Eliza held the next post steady while Daniel positioned his hammer. "Thomas never pretended to be something he wasn't. Told me straight when we met that he was a farmer, not a poet, and that he'd love me the best way he knew how. Turned out that was more than enough." Daniel struck the post with careful, measured blows. "Sounds like a good marriage." It was. 15 years of pulling in the same direction, like I told you before. We had our disagreements, but we never stopped being partners. Eliza looked out across the grassland toward the mountains. "I suppose that's what I'm hoping for again. Maybe not the same kind of love Thomas and I had, but the same kind of partnership." "I think we might manage that," Daniel said, driving the post home with a final strike. "We seem to work well together." As if to prove his point, they fell into an easy rhythm for the rest of the afternoon, with Eliza holding posts while Daniel set them, and both of them stretching wire between the new fence line. By evening, they'd repaired the damage and reinforced the entire section. Standing back to admire their work, Eliza felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in months. The fence was solid and straight, the kind of barrier that would keep cattle where they belonged, and send a message to anyone who might be watching that the McGraw homestead was still a working ranch. "Tomorrow we should ride the rest of the property line," Daniel suggested. "Make sure there haven't been other incidents we haven't discovered yet." Eliza nodded, already planning the route they'd take. But as they walked back toward the house in the gathering dusk, she found herself glancing sideways at Daniel, noting how naturally he'd started using words like "we" and "our" when talking. About the ranch. Maybe this arrangement would work out better than either of them had dared hope. The handmade quilt lay folded at the foot of Eliza's bed, its intricate patterns telling stories of patient winter evenings and careful stitching. Daniel had noticed it while helping move his few possessions into the smaller bedroom, and something about the detailed needlework made him pause. "My sister Margaret made that," Eliza said, noticing his attention. "Took her 3 years working on it every evening after the children were in bed. She gave it to me when Thomas and I got married, said every home needed something made with love." Daniel ran his fingers lightly over the quilt's surface, feeling the tiny, even stitches that held the layers together. She was talented. This kind of work takes patience and skill. Margaret was always the artistic one in our family. I could cook and clean and tend animals, but she could make beautiful things with her hands. Eliza's voice carried the weight of old grief. She died in childbirth 5 years ago, out in California. Her husband sent me word, but by the time the letter reached me, she'd been in the ground for months. The storm that had been building all afternoon chose that moment to break over the canyon, sending sheets of rain against the windows and rattling the shutters. Daniel looked out at the darkening sky, calculating how much damage heavy rain might do to their recently repaired fences. "Storm's going to be a bad one," he said. "I should check on the horses and make sure the barn doors latch tight." "I'll come with you," Eliza said, reaching for her rain slicker. "Rosa gets spooked by thunder and she'll need calming." They ran through the downpour to the barn, both soaked before they'd covered half the distance. Inside, the horses were restless but safe, and Daniel quickly moved to check the roof for leaks, while Eliza gentled the frightened mare. "Easy, girl," Eliza murmured, running her hands along Rosa's neck. "It's just noise. Nothing's going to hurt." "You in here?" Daniel found 2 places where water was seeping through the old roof, but nothing that couldn't be managed with strategically placed buckets. As he positioned the containers to catch the drips, he became aware of Eliza's voice, soft and melodic, singing something low and soothing to calm the horses. He'd never heard her sing before. Her speaking voice was direct and practical, but when she sang, something deeper emerged, a gentleness that she usually kept hidden beneath her capable exterior. The melody was unfamiliar, but the effect was immediate. The horses settled, their nervous movements stilling as they responded to the comfort in her voice. "That's beautiful," Daniel said when she finished. "What was it?" Eliza looked embarrassed, as if she hadn't realized he was listening. "Just something my mother used to sing when I was small. Irish lullaby about storms passing and morning coming." "Your mother taught you well. Music has a way of gentling creatures, horses especially." They settled in to wait out the worst of the storm, sitting on hay bales near the horses and listening to the rain drum against the barn roof. The forced intimacy of their shelter made conversation both easier and more dangerous. Easier because there was nothing else to do. Dangerous because they were alone together in a way they hadn't been since Daniel's arrival. "Tell me about your family," Eliza said, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. "Were they musical too?" Daniel considered the question, sifting through memories he usually kept locked away. "My mother played piano. Nothing fancy, just hymns and a few popular songs she'd learned as a girl. But she had a way of making even the simplest melody sound special." He paused, remembering Sunday evenings in the farmhouse parlor. "My father would sit and listen while she played, and you could see the work and worry leave his face. Music was her gift to him after long days in the fields." "That sounds lovely." It was. Daniel's voice grew thoughtful. "I always assumed I'd have that someday. A wife who could make our house feel like home with music and laughter, children to fill the empty spaces. Seemed like the natural order of things when I was young." "What changed your mind?" Daniel was quiet for so long that Eliza thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, as if he was testing each one before releasing it. "I was engaged once. Sarah Mitchell, daughter of a prosperous farmer in Kansas. Pretty, accomplished, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife." He stared at his hands. "Problem was, I wasn't everything she wanted in a husband. When things got difficult, when my family lost the farm and I couldn't provide the comfortable life she'd expected, she decided she'd made a mistake." Eliza felt a surge of anger toward a woman she'd never met. That must have hurt terribly. At the time, yes, but looking back, maybe Sarah did us both a favor. She wanted security and social position. I wanted a partner who'd stand by me when times got rough. We were looking for different things. "And now?" Eliza asked softly. Daniel met her eyes directly. "Now I think I might have found what I was really looking for, even if it came in a way I never expected." The words created a moment of charged silence between them. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the barn, something had shifted. Without quite knowing how it happened, they'd moved from polite conversation to something more honest and vulnerable. Daniel, Eliza began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was feeling. "I know," he said. "This is getting more complicated than either of us planned. Is that necessarily a bad thing?" Before Daniel could answer, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the barn, followed immediately by the sound of splintering wood. They both jumped up and ran to the door, peering out into the storm-lashed night. One of the large cottonwoods near the house had been struck by lightning. The massive trunk had split down the middle, and half the tree had crashed down onto the front porch, smashing through the roof and into what had been Eliza's front room. "Dear God," Eliza breathed, staring at the destruction. Daniel was already moving, grabbing a lantern and heading for the door. "We need to get in there and see how bad the damage is. If water's getting in, we'll lose everything that isn't already destroyed." They fought their way through the wind and rain to the damaged house. The front door was blocked by debris, but they managed to get in through the kitchen. The sight that greeted them was devastating. The entire front room was open to the sky, furniture smashed beneath the fallen tree, and rain pouring in through the gaping hole in the roof. "The bedroom," Eliza said, her voice tight with panic. "Margaret's quilt, but the bedroom had been spared. The tree had fallen at an angle that demolished the front room and part of the kitchen, but left the sleeping quarters intact." Eliza's relief was visible as she checked her most precious possessions and found them safe. "We can't stay here tonight," Daniel said, surveying the damage. "Maybe not for several nights, depending on how long it takes to get this cleaned up and temporary." "Repairs made." "The barn," Eliza said without hesitation. "It's dry and warm, and there's enough room for both of us if we don't mind sharing space with the horses." Daniel nodded. "We'll make do. Tomorrow we can start figuring out how to fix this mess." As they gathered blankets and essential supplies from the undamaged parts of the house, Eliza found herself thinking about partnership again. Here was another crisis, another test of their fragile arrangement. But this time, she didn't feel the crushing weight of facing disaster alone. Daniel worked methodically, securing what could be saved and assessing what would need immediate attention once the storm passed. His calm competence in the face of crisis reminded Eliza why she'd chosen him for this arrangement. But more than that, she was beginning to see glimpses of the man he'd been before life had knocked him down. Capable, thoughtful, someone who could be counted on when things went wrong. That night, they made beds of hay and horse blankets in the barn's tack room, separated by only a few feet but maintaining the careful respectability their situation demanded. The storm continued to rage outside, but neither of them slept much. Instead, they talked quietly about repair plans and priorities, their voices growing more comfortable with each passing hour. "We'll need lumber," Daniel said, staring up at the barn roof, "and skilled help to rebuild that section of the house properly. That's going to cost money we don't have." "I've got some jewelry I can sell," Eliza replied. "Wedding ring, a few pieces that belong to my mother, should be enough to cover materials if we do most of the work ourselves." Daniel turned to look at her in the dim light. "You shouldn't have to sell your wedding ring. It's just a symbol, Daniel. The marriage it represented is over, and the new one we're planning is built on different foundations." Eliza's voice was matter-of-fact, but Daniel heard the underlying sadness. "Besides, Thomas would understand. He always said you use what you have to protect what matters most." "What matters most?" Daniel asked quietly. Eliza was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain and the gentle sounds of the horses settling for the night. "This place. The chance to build something lasting, and maybe—" She paused, then spoke with careful honesty. "Maybe the possibility that what we're building together could become something neither of us expected." In the darkness of the barn, with the storm raging outside and their future uncertain, Daniel reached out and found Eliza's hand. She didn't pull away. "I think it already has," he said. The letter from back east lay crumpled in Daniel's hands, its edges worn from being read and reread. Eliza had found it that morning while helping him organize his few possessions in preparation for their wedding the next day. He'd tried to hide it, but the pain in his eyes when she'd asked about it told her this wasn't just any correspondence. "You don't have to tell me about it," she said gently. Sitting across from him at the kitchen table they'd salvaged from the storm damage. "But if you want to talk, I'm here to listen." Daniel smoothed the letter carefully, his movements deliberate and slow. "It's from my cousin in Missouri, news about my family, what's left of it." The morning sun streamed through the windows of their makeshift living space in the barn. They'd been camping there for a week while repairing the house, and the close quarters had created an intimacy neither had expected. Simple domestic tasks, sharing meals, tending the fire, working side by side, had worn away some of the careful politeness between them. "My brother Jonathan died last winter," Daniel continued, his voice steady but hollow. "Pneumonia. Left behind a wife and 3 children with no means of support." Eliza felt her heart clench. "I'm sorry. Were you close?" "Close. Enough. John was 5 years younger than me, always looked up to me when we were boys." Daniel refolded the letter with careful precision. "The thing is, Mary, his wife, she wrote asking if I could come back, help her keep the farm, provide for the children. She's got nowhere else to turn." The implications hung between them like a physical presence. Tomorrow they were supposed to be married, but now Daniel had family obligations, pulling him back toward the life he'd left behind. "What did you tell her?" Eliza asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Nothing yet. Letter arrived 3 days ago, and I've been trying to figure out what to say." Daniel looked up at her, and Eliza saw the conflict tearing at him. "Mary's a good woman. The children, they're innocent in all this. Little Sarah's only 6, and the boys aren't much older." Eliza understood duty and family obligation better than most. She'd given up her own dreams more than once to care for relatives who needed help. But the thought of Daniel leaving now, just when they'd begun to find their footing together, made her feel hollow inside. "You're thinking of going back," she said. "It wasn't a question. I don't know what I'm thinking." Daniel's honesty was both painful and appreciated. "Part of me knows Mary needs help, knows those children don't deserve to suffer because their father died. But another part of me—" "What?" "Another part of me doesn't want to leave what we're building here." He met her eyes directly. "I didn't expect that, Eliza. When I agreed to this arrangement, I thought it would be simple, practical. A business partnership that might grow into friendship if we were lucky. And now?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Now I find myself thinking about this place as home. About you as, well, as more than just a partner in a business arrangement." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Eliza felt her own carefully guarded heart respond to his words, but she forced herself to think practically. "About the situation. How much money would Mary need to keep the farm?" she asked. Daniel looked surprised by the question. "I don't know. Enough to pay the mortgage, buy seed for spring planting, feed the family through winter. More than I've got, that's certain. But not more than we might have if this place becomes profitable again." Eliza leaned forward, her mind working through possibilities. What if we sent her what we could spare? Not enough to solve all her problems, maybe, but enough to get her through the immediate crisis. "Eliza, we can barely afford to repair our own house. We can't take on responsibility for my brother's family too, can't we?" Eliza stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land they'd been working so hard to restore. "Daniel, if we're going to be married, really married, not just pretending for convenience, then your family becomes my family. That's how these things work." Daniel stared at her, clearly struggling with the implications of what she was suggesting. "You'd be willing to help people you've never met." "I'd be willing to help your family," Eliza corrected. "There's a difference." She turned back to face him, and Daniel saw something in her expression he hadn't noticed before. The careful walls she'd built around her heart were beginning to crack, letting through glimpses of the generous, loving woman she'd been before grief and hardship had taught her to be cautious. "Besides," she continued, "Mary might not need as much help as she thinks. Widows are stronger than most people give them credit for. Sometimes all they need is someone to believe in them and provide a little support, until they find their footing. Daniel stood and moved toward her, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "You're remarkable." "You know that?" "I'm practical," Eliza replied, but her cheeks flushed at the compliment. "And I'm selfish enough to want to keep you here." "Selfish? Don't pretend you haven't noticed that this arrangement is becoming something more than either of us planned." Eliza's voice was steady, but Daniel could see the vulnerability beneath her words. "I lost one husband to circumstances beyond our control. I don't particularly want to lose another one to circumstances we might be able to manage." The word "another" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had quite acknowledged before. Daniel reached out slowly, giving Eliza time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he took her hands in his. "Is that what I am?" he asked quietly. "Your husband? Not just a business partner or a convenient arrangement?" Eliza looked down at their joined hands, noting the contrast between his calloused palms and her work-roughened fingers. Both of them bore the marks of hard living, but somehow together they felt stronger than either did alone. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'd like the chance to find out." Daniel lifted one hand to touch her face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Then we'll write to Mary together. Send what help we can, and see if that's enough to keep her going until she can manage on her own. And if it's not enough, then we'll figure out what comes next when we get there." Daniel's voice was certain now, his earlier conflict resolved. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." Eliza felt something tight in her chest finally begin to loosen. For the first time since Thomas died, she was part of a we again. Not the desperate, practical partnership she'd proposed to a stranger, but something that felt like it might grow into real partnership, real caring, maybe even real love. "Together," she repeated, testing the word and finding it fitted perfectly. The afternoon was spent working on final preparations for their wedding, but something fundamental had shifted between them. They moved around each other with new awareness, their hands brushing more frequently, their conversations taking on layers of meaning that hadn't been there before. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple dinner, Daniel finally spoke about Mary's letter again. "I want to write. Back tonight," he said. "Let her know help is coming, but also let her know that my life is here now, that I've found something worth staying for." Eliza smiled, the expression transforming her usually serious face. "What have you found?" Daniel looked at her across the flickering firelight, seeing past the practical arrangements and survival strategies to the woman underneath. "A future," he said simply. "One I never thought I'd have." The shared meal by candlelight had been Daniel's idea, though he'd struggled to explain it without sounding foolish. They'd been married for 3 days now, a simple ceremony in town with the preacher and 2 witnesses, but their relationship still felt suspended between the practical arrangement they'd agreed to and something more personal that neither quite dared to name. "We should celebrate," he'd said that morning, while they worked together to frame the new section of roof. "Marriage is supposed to be marked somehow, even a practical one like ours." Eliza had looked at him with surprise and something that might have been pleasure. "What did you have in mind?" "Nothing fancy, just a proper dinner. Maybe use your grandmother's china instead of the tin plates, light some candles." Daniel had felt his cheeks warm as he spoke. "Make it feel like an occasion." Now, as evening settled over the canyon, and they sat across from each other at the small table, Eliza wondered when exactly her feelings about this arrangement had begun to change. The man across from her bore little resemblance to the desperate drifter who'd stumbled onto her property 3 weeks ago. Daniel moved with quiet confidence now, spoke with the authority of someone who belonged here, and looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "The beef turned out well," she said, cutting another small piece from the roast they'd prepared together. "Your grandmother's recipe?" "My mother's, actually. She learned it from a neighbor woman when they first settled in Pennsylvania. Said it was the first dish that made my father take notice of her cooking." Eliza smiled at the memory. "According to family legend, he proposed within a week." Daniel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Smart man, this roast would convince me to propose to anyone who could make it. The words hung in the air between them, both innocent and loaded with meaning. They were already married, legally bound in a partnership that had started as pure survival strategy. But sitting here in the candlelight, sharing stories and comfortable silences, it felt like something else entirely. "Daniel," Eliza began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was thinking. "What is it?" She set down her fork and looked at him directly. "When you agreed to marry me, what exactly were you expecting? I mean, what did you think our life together would look like?" Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he approached most things. "Honestly, I thought we'd work well together, share responsibilities, maybe become friends over time. I figured we'd live like business partners who happen to share a house. And now I find myself wanting things I hadn't planned on wanting." His voice was quiet but steady. "I look forward to our conversations at the end of the day. I like the way you hum while you're cooking. I find myself thinking about your laugh during the middle of difficult work." Eliza felt her breath catch slightly. "Those sound like the thoughts of a man who's developing feelings for his wife." "Maybe I am." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Eliza reached across the table and placed her hand over his, feeling the calloused warmth of his palm. "I've been having similar thoughts," she said. "About my husband." The word husband carried different weight now than it had during their practical negotiations. Daniel turned his hand up to capture her fingers, threading them together. "Where does that leave us?" he asked. "I don't know. Somewhere new, I think." Eliza looked around their makeshift dining room, really just a corner of the barn they'd furnished, with salvaged furniture and brightened with candles. "I spent 15 years learning to be Thomas's wife. I'm not sure I know how to be anyone else's." "I don't want you to be Thomas's wife," Daniel said quietly. "I want you to be mine." The words sent warmth flooding through Eliza's chest. She studied Daniel's face in the flickering candlelight, noting the way his eyes had changed over the past weeks. The wariness was gone, replaced by something steadier and more hopeful. "Are we talking about changing the terms of our arrangement?" she asked. "I'm talking about making it real," Daniel replied. "Not just legal, but real. A marriage based on choice instead of necessity." Eliza felt her heart begin to race. "That's a significant change from what we originally agreed to." "It is. And if you're not ready for that, or if you don't want the same thing, then we can continue as we planned. I won't pressure you, Eliza, but I wanted you to know that my feelings have changed." Eliza looked down at their joined hands, thinking about the enormous shift from practical arrangement to genuine partnership. The idea terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I need to be honest with you about something," she said finally. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of caring too much, of letting my guard down and getting hurt again." She met his eyes. "When Thomas died, I thought the pain might kill me. I don't know if I could survive losing someone else I'd grown to love." Daniel squeezed her fingers gently. "I can't promise I won't die, Eliza. None of us can make that promise. But I can promise that if you give me your heart, I'll treat it like the precious thing it is. And if I'm not ready to give it, not yet, then we take things slowly. Let whatever's growing between us develop naturally, without pressure or demands." Daniel's voice was patient and understanding. "I'm not going anywhere, Eliza. Whether we're business partners or something more, I'm committed to making this work." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief and gratitude. She'd been braced for demands, for pressure to move faster than she was comfortable with. Instead, Daniel was offering her time and space to find her way to whatever this was becoming. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For understanding, for being patient, for making me feel like maybe I could be brave enough to try again." Daniel brought their joined hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You're the bravest person I know, Eliza McGraw. You took a chance on a broken-down drifter when you could have just as easily sent him on his way. You weren't broken down. You were just knocked down. There's a difference, is there? Broken things can't be fixed. Knocked down things just need help getting back up." Eliza smiled at him across the candlelit table. "You've been getting back." Up ever since you got here. They finished their meal in comfortable conversation, talking about plans for expanding the vegetable garden and whether they should invest in more cattle come spring. But underneath the practical discussions was a new awareness, a sense that they were planning not just as partners, but as a couple building a future together. Later, as they cleaned up the dishes together, Daniel spoke quietly. "Eliza, would it be all right if I kissed you good night?" She turned to face him, noting the careful way he asked, leaving her complete freedom to say no. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that." The kiss was gentle and brief, but it carried the weight of possibility. When they separated, both of them were smiling. "Good night, husband," Eliza said softly. "Good night, wife," as they went to their separate bedrooms. Still maintaining the careful boundaries they'd established, both of them carried the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer just two people making the best of a difficult situation. They were becoming something new together, something neither had expected, but both were beginning to want. The hidden will lay beneath the loose floorboard in what had been Thomas's study, yellowed with age and folded around a letter that made Eliza's blood run cold. She'd been searching for the deed papers that the bank wanted to see, routine verification for a loan to buy more cattle, when her foot had found the board that didn't sit quite right. Daniel was in town picking up lumber for the final roof. Repairs when she made the discovery. Part of her wished he were here to help her process what she was reading, but another part was grateful for the privacy to absorb the blow alone first. The will was dated 6 months before Thomas's death, written in his careful handwriting and properly witnessed. But its contents turned everything Eliza thought she knew about her situation upside down. According to the document, Thomas had left the homestead not to her, but to his estranged half-brother, Benjamin McGraw, with only a provision that Eliza be allowed to reside on the property for a period not to exceed 2 years following Thomas's death, provided she maintains the property in good condition and remains unmarried. The accompanying letter, written in the same careful hand, explained Thomas's reasoning in words that felt like a knife to her heart. "My dear Eliza will surely think me cruel for this decision, but I cannot bear the thought of her struggling alone to maintain a property she has neither the strength nor the business knowledge to manage successfully. Benjamin has always been the practical one in our family, and though we have had our differences, he will ensure the land is put to proper use. I pray Eliza will understand that this decision comes from love, not lack of faith in her capabilities." Eliza sank into Thomas's old chair, the documents trembling in her hands. 2 years. She'd been living on borrowed time without knowing it, and now that time was nearly up. Worse still, her marriage to Daniel had violated the terms that allowed her to stay at all. The implications crashed over her like a flash flood. Everything she'd told Daniel about owning the land free and clear had been wrong. The homestead deed in her apron pocket was meaningless, a copy of the original filing, not a current ownership document. She'd married Daniel under false pretenses, promising him a partnership in property that wasn't even hers to share. The sound of wagon wheels on the track outside made her heart race. Daniel was returning, probably excited to share news from town, and eager to continue the roof work. How could she tell him that their entire arrangement was built on a foundation that didn't exist? She quickly refolded the will and letter, placing them in her apron pocket alongside the useless deed. Her hands shook as she tried to compose herself, but when Daniel walked through the door carrying lumber and whistling cheerfully, she couldn't manage even a false smile. "Eliza, what's wrong?" He set down the boards immediately and crossed to her side. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse than a ghost," she managed, pulling the documents from her pocket. "I found these under a loose board in the study. Thomas hid them there, probably hoping I'd never have to see them." Daniel took the papers with a frown, his expression growing darker as he read. When he finished, he looked up at her with something between sympathy and confusion. "I don't understand. This says the property belongs to Thomas's brother Benjamin, But you have the deed, a copy of the original filing, Eliza said bitterly, not proof of current ownership. Thomas apparently made a new will without telling. Me leaving everything to his half-brother with the condition that I could stay only 2 years, and only if I remained unmarried. Daniel sank into the chair across from her, the full implications sinking in. When did Thomas die? 22 months ago. Eliza's voice was hollow. I have less than 2 months left under the terms of the will. And by marrying you, I've already violated the conditions that let me stay at all. They sat in silence for several minutes, both absorbing the magnitude of the disaster. Everything they'd worked for, planned for, hoped for, was suddenly in jeopardy. Worse still, Eliza realized. She'd unknowingly deceived Daniel into a marriage based on property she didn't actually own. "Daniel, I'm so sorry," she said finally. "I had no idea. If you'd known, you never would have made the arrangement in the first place," he finished. "And I never would have had the chance to fall in love with you." The words stopped Eliza cold. "What did you say?" Daniel looked at her directly, his expression serious but unashamed. "I said I've fallen in love with you. This changes a lot of things, but it doesn't change that." "How can you say that? I've ruined everything. I promised you a partnership in land that isn't mine to share. I married you under false pretenses. You married me because we both needed help and companionship. The land was part of the arrangement, but it wasn't the only part." Daniel reached across and took her hands. "Eliza, look at me. Do you think I stayed just for the property rights?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that their relationship was built on the practical foundations they'd both claimed to want. But looking into Daniel's eyes, she knew better. "No," she whispered. "I don't think that anymore. Then we figure out how to deal with this together, just like we've dealt with everything else." Eliza felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by both the crisis and Daniel's steadfast loyalty. "What if we can't? What if this Benjamin decides to claim the property and throw us both off? Then we'll find another way to build a life together, with or without this land." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see 3 riders coming up the track at a purposeful pace. Marcus Blackwood rode in the center, flanked by 2 men Eliza didn't recognize. Well-dressed city types who looked like lawyers or land agents. "Trouble," Daniel said grimly, standing to look out the window. "More than you know," Eliza replied, fear making her voice tight. "Daniel, what if Blackwood knows about the will? What if that's why he's been so confident about getting this land?" Possibility hit them both simultaneously. Marcus Blackwood had been pressuring Eliza to sell for almost 2 years, exactly since Thomas's death. His tactics had escalated recently, but he'd always acted like a man who knew he'd eventually get what he wanted. If he'd somehow learned about the will and the conditions it imposed, he might have been waiting for the 2-year deadline to expire. "Or waiting for me to remarry and violate the terms automatically," Eliza said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. Daniel's expression hardened. "You think he knows about Benjamin McGraw? I think he might be working with him. Think about it. Benjamin gets clear title to the land, then immediately sells it to Blackwood for a profit they split between them. It would explain why Blackwood's been so persistent and so confident." The riders had reached the yard now, and Marcus Blackwood was dismounting with the satisfied expression of a man who held all the winning cards. One of his companions carried a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained legal documents. "Mrs. McGraw," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "I think it's time we had a conversation about your situation here." Daniel and Eliza exchanged grim looks. The confrontation they'd been dreading was about to begin, and their position was far weaker than they'd realized. "What do we do?" Eliza asked quietly. Daniel checked the placement of his father's cavalry saber, which he'd taken to wearing since the fence sabotage. "We face it head-on, and we don't give them anything easily." "Together." "Together," Daniel confirmed, squeezing her hand once before they went outside to meet whatever Blackwood had planned. As they stepped onto the porch, Eliza felt the weight of the hidden will in her pocket like a stone. Everything they'd built over the past month was about to be tested in ways neither of them had imagined. But Daniel's steady presence beside her reminded her that some things, the most important things, weren't written on legal documents or dependent on property ownership. Whatever happened next, they'd face it as partners. And maybe, if they were very lucky and very clever, they'd find a way to turn this disaster into something they could survive. Daniel's father's cavalry saber hung at his side like a promise, its worn leather scabbard bearing the scratches and stains of 20 years of military service. Colonel William Hart had carried this blade through the Mexican War and beyond, and Daniel could almost feel his father's steady presence as he prepared for what might be the most important fight of his life. "Remember," he said quietly to Eliza, as they watched Blackwood and his companions approach the house, "we don't show them the will unless we absolutely have to. Knowledge is the only advantage we have right now." Eliza nodded, her face pale but determined. The past 3 hours had been spent in frantic preparation, gathering every legal document they could find, sending word to the few neighbors who might support them, and trying to piece together a strategy from the fragments of information they possessed. "Mrs. McGraw," Marcus Blackwood called out as he reached the porch steps. "Or should I say Mrs. Hart now? Congratulations on your recent marriage, though I have to say the timing seems rather convenient." The larger of Blackwood's companions stepped forward, removing a document from his leather satchel. "Mrs. Hart, I'm Abraham Whitmore, attorney representing the interests of Benjamin McGraw in the matter of the Thomas McGraw estate. I believe we need to discuss your current occupation of this property." Daniel felt Eliza stiffen beside him, but her voice remained steady when she replied, "Gentlemen, you're welcome to state your business, but I should mention that my husband and I have work to attend to." "Please make this brief." Whitmore's smile was coldly professional. "Oh, I think you'll find this conversation worth your time. You see, we've recently located certain documents that clarify the ownership status of this homestead. Documents that suggest your legal right to remain here expired some time ago." "What documents?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. Blackwood couldn't quite hide his satisfaction. "A will, Mr. Hart. A properly executed and witnessed will, leaving this property to Benjamin McGraw, with certain very specific conditions regarding Mrs. McGraw's, continued residence." The use of her former name was deliberate, designed to emphasize that her marriage to Daniel had violated the terms of her tenancy. Eliza felt the familiar surge of anger that had sustained her through 2 years of Blackwood's harassment. "And I suppose Mr. McGraw is conveniently willing to sell this property to you, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Benjamin McGraw is a businessman who understands the value of liquid assets over remote real estate," Whitmore replied smoothly. "He's authorized me to make you a final offer to vacate peacefully. $500 and safe passage to wherever you'd like to relocate." "That's generous," Daniel said, his voice deceptively mild. "Considering you seem to believe we have no legal standing here at all." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "We're trying to be reasonable, Hart. Mrs. Hart, violated the terms of her tenancy by remarrying. She has no legal right to this property, and you certainly don't. We could have the sheriff evict you immediately." "Could you?" Eliza asked. "Because I notice Sheriff Patterson isn't with you today. Is that because even he has limits to how far he'll bend the law for your benefit?" The comment hit home. Whitmore and Blackwood exchanged glances, and Daniel realized that their legal position might not be as solid as they wanted it to appear. "The truth is," Daniel said, taking a calculated risk, "you need us to leave voluntarily because forcing us out would attract the kind of attention you can't afford. Too many questions about how you learned about a will that was hidden away where even the widow couldn't find it." Blackwood's face flushed red. "Are you accusing me of something, Hart?" I'm observing that your knowledge of Thomas McGraw's private affairs seems remarkably detailed for a man who claimed to barely know him. The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut. Eliza could see Whitmore calculating, trying to determine how much they actually knew and how much was bluff. The fact that they hadn't produced the will themselves suggested they might not have it, or might not want to reveal how they'd obtained their information. Perhaps, Whitmore said carefully, we should discuss this matter more privately. Mr. Blackwood, would you and your associate wait by the horses? Mrs. Hart and I need to clarify certain legal points. Blackwood looked reluctant to leave, but Whitmore's authority was clear. As the rancher and his hired man moved out of earshot, the attorney's demeanor shifted slightly. Let me be direct with you both, he said quietly. Benjamin McGraw is not a patient man, and his partners in this transaction are even less so. The offer I've made is genuine, but it won't remain open indefinitely. Partners? Daniel asked. I thought this was about Benjamin claiming his inheritance. Whitmore's slight hesitation told them everything they needed to know. This wasn't just about family inheritance. There were business interests involved, probably mining or railroad speculation that made this particular piece of land valuable beyond its agricultural potential. Mr. Whitmore, Eliza said, I appreciate your attempt at reasonableness, but you seem to be operating under some misconceptions about our situation. Such as the assumption that we're helpless and ignorant of our rights. Eliza reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a single folded document. Not the will, but a letter she'd written that morning. I've sent word to the territorial capital requesting a full investigation of land transactions in this county over the past 2 years, specifically focusing on the relationship between certain ranchers and territorial officials. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. If there were mining or railroad interests involved, territorial politics would be part of the equation, and corruption in land deals was a sensitive subject for officials trying to prepare New Mexico for statehood. Whitmore's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Hart, I hope you're not making accusations you can't substantiate. I'm making inquiries, Eliza replied calmly, as is my right as a territorial citizen. Daniel watched the exchange with growing admiration for his wife's strategic thinking. She was buying them time and applying pressure in areas where their opponents might be vulnerable. There's one more thing you should know, Daniel added. Mrs. Hart isn't the only person with an interest in seeing justice done here. I've got friends in this territory, men I served with who understand the value of standing up to bullies. This was also a bluff, but Daniel sold it with the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to project authority during his military years. The truth was that most of his old army contacts were scattered or dead, but Whitmore didn't need to know that. Gentlemen, a new voice interrupted from behind them. They turned to see Reverend Morrison climbing down from a wagon, followed by 2 other men Eliza recognized as neighboring ranchers. I hope we're not interrupting important business. Relief flooded through Eliza. She'd sent word asking for witnesses to whatever confrontation Blackwood might attempt, but she hadn't been sure anyone would come. Now here were 3 respected members of the community, their presence changing the dynamics of the situation completely. Reverend Morrison, Whitmore said stiffly, this is a private legal matter. Is it? Morrison replied mildly. Because from where I stand, it looks like 3 armed men confronting a married couple on their own property. That seems like the kind of situation where community oversight might be appropriate. One of the ranchers, Jim Valdez, who owned a spread 5 miles south, stepped forward. Mrs. Hart, Daniel, is there a problem here? Nothing we can't handle, Jim, Daniel replied. These gentlemen were just explaining some legal theories about property ownership. We were discussing whether their theories hold water. Blackwood had been growing more agitated throughout the conversation. Now he stepped forward, his patience clearly exhausted. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Hart, your wife has no legal claim to this land. The property belongs to Benjamin McGraw, and he wants you gone. You can leave peacefully with compensation, or you can be removed by force. Those are your options. Actually, Reverend Morrison said quietly, I believe there might be a third option. All eyes turned to the elderly preacher, who reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking envelope. I received this by telegraph this morning, he continued. It's from Benjamin McGraw himself, sent from Kansas City, where he's been residing for the past 3 years. Whitmore went very still. That's impossible. Mr. McGraw is my client, according to this telegram, Morrison interrupted. Benjamin McGraw has never authorized anyone to act on his behalf regarding his half-brother's estate. In fact, he says he's been trying to locate Mrs. McGraw for over a year to inform her that he's formally renouncing any claim to the property. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza felt her knees go weak with relief and disbelief, while Daniel stepped closer to her side, his hand moving instinctively to the saber at his side. Blackwood's face had gone from red to pale in the space of seconds. That's impossible. We have documentation, forged documentation, apparently, Morrison said sadly. Mr. McGraw was quite specific about never having executed any will or assignment regarding the homestead. He says his last contact with his half-brother was over 5 years ago, and it was not amicable. Whitmore was already moving toward his horse, his composure finally cracking. There's obviously been some miscommunication. We'll need to verify. You'll need to leave, Daniel said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd finally had enough. Now, before this becomes a matter for the territorial marshal instead of the local sheriff. As Blackwood and his companions retreated in disorder, Eliza felt tears of relief beginning to flow. The past few hours had been among the most terrifying of her life, but they'd survived. More than that, they'd won. How? She asked Morrison when the 3 riders had disappeared down the track. The preacher smiled. Pure luck, my dear. I happened to mention your situation to a colleague in Kansas City, and he knew Benjamin McGraw personally. It seems Mr. McGraw has been quite successful in the cattle business and wants nothing to do with New Mexico Territory or his half-brother's legacy. As the neighbors departed and evening settled over the canyon, Daniel and Eliza stood together on their porch, finally, able to breathe freely for the first time in hours. It's really over? Eliza asked. The legal threat is over, Daniel replied, but something tells me Marcus Blackwood isn't going to give up this easily. Men like him don't walk away from something they want just because the law says no. Eliza nodded, understanding. They'd won this battle, but the war for their future was far from over. The original survey stakes lay buried beneath 3 inches of sandy soil, their weathered wood bearing the carved marks that would prove the true boundaries of the McGraw homestead. Daniel worked carefully with a small spade, uncovering each marker while Eliza held the surveyor's map they'd found in Thomas's papers. This one's definitely been moved, Daniel said, examining a stake that sat 10 feet closer to the creek than the map indicated. Look at the dirt around it. It's been disturbed recently, and the wood doesn't have the same weathering as the others. It was dawn on what both of them suspected would be their final confrontation with Marcus Blackwood. Despite yesterday's legal victory, neither Daniel nor Eliza believed the rancher would simply accept defeat. Men who poisoned cattle and burned fences didn't walk away from losing gracefully. How much land would moving the stakes give him? Eliza asked, studying the discrepancies between the map and the current marker positions. Maybe 8 acres total, but the most important 8 acres on the property. Daniel stood and brushed dirt from his hands. Moving this boundary puts the best water access on his side of the line instead of yours. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their investigation. A large group of riders was coming up the valley, at least a dozen men, more than Blackwood had ever brought before. Daniel felt his stomach tighten as he recognized what this represented. Not negotiation or legal pressure, but the kind of force that settled disputes permanently. Get to the house, he told Eliza quietly. Load the rifles and stay away from the windows. I'm not leaving you out here alone. Eliza, this isn't going to be handled with words. These men are here for a fight, and I need to know you're safe." She looked at the approaching riders, then back at Daniel's face, reading the grim determination there. "All right. But Daniel, come back to me." He touched her face gently. "I intend to." As Eliza ran toward the house, Daniel walked to meet the riders, his father's cavalry saber hanging at his side and Thomas's hunting rifle in his hands. He'd chosen his position carefully, close enough to the creek that the morning sun would be in the rider's eyes, with the house at his back and good cover among the cottonwood trees. Marcus Blackwood rode at the front of the group, his face set, in the hard lines of a man who'd decided that patience and legal maneuvering had failed him. Behind him came his regular hired hands, plus several men Daniel didn't recognize, hard cases with the look of professional troublemakers. "Hart!" Blackwood called out when they were still 50 yards away. "This is your last chance to ride out." "Of here alive. Funny thing about chances, Blackwood," Daniel replied, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "I keep thinking this is your last chance to avoid making a mistake you can't take back." Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you won something yesterday with that preacher's telegram. All you did was delay the inevitable. This land belongs to me now, one way or another." "Because you moved the survey stakes?" Daniel asked. "Because you forged legal documents, or because you're used to taking what you want from people who can't fight back?" The accusation hung in the air between them, and Daniel saw several of Blackwood's hired men exchange glances. Some of them might be willing to fight for wages, but facing down a man who clearly knew their employer's methods might give them pause. "You've got a big mouth for a man facing 12-to-1 odds," one of the strangers called out. Daniel smiled grimly. 12-to-1? I count different. As if summoned by his words, 5 riders emerged from the trees behind Blackwood's group. Jim Valdez, and 4 of his ranch hands, all armed and positioned to cut off any retreat. At the same time, Reverend Morrison appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley, carrying a rifle and accompanied by 2 other men from town. "Looks more like 12-to-9 now," Daniel continued. "And those 9 include men who know this country. Better than your hired guns do." Blackwood's confidence visibly wavered as he realized his overwhelming advantage had just evaporated. But he'd come too far to back down now, invested too much in this confrontation to walk away empty-handed. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "You're still squatters on land you don't own." "Actually," Eliza's voice carried from the porch, "we have documentation that says otherwise." Daniel didn't turn around, but he could hear the authority in his wife's voice. She'd found something, the real survey records maybe, or additional proof of their legal claim. "Benjamin McGraw sent more than just a telegram renouncing his claim," she continued. "He sent a properly notarized quitclaim deed transferring any interest he might have had in this property to me personally. It arrived this morning with the mail wagon. The lie was beautifully delivered, confident and specific enough to sound completely believable." Daniel felt a surge of admiration for Eliza's quick thinking and strategic timing. "You're bluffing," Blackwood said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Reverend Morrison witnessed the document's arrival. So did the mail carrier and both of Jim Valdez's boys. Eliza stepped into view on the porch, holding what looked like an official document. "Or would you like to examine it?" The standoff stretched taut as a wire fence, 12 men on horseback facing a mixed group of neighbors and one determined woman with a piece of paper that might or might not be what she claimed. 2 wedding rings hung from a simple chain around Eliza's neck, her original band from Thomas and the new one Daniel had given her just days before. She touched them now through her shirt as she watched the tension build to a breaking point in the yard below. The rings represented 2 different kinds of love, 2 different chapters of her life, but in this moment they both meant the same. "Good thing. She had something worth fighting for." "Enough talking," one of Blackwood's hired guns called out. "Boss, we came here to settle this. Let's settle it." But even as the man spoke, Eliza could see doubt spreading through the group. The arrival of Jim Valdez and the other neighbors had changed the equation from intimidation to genuine conflict, and most hired men preferred easier work than facing armed resistance from locals who knew the terrain. "Stand down, Carson," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was a man accustomed to getting his way through pressure and legal manipulation, not open warfare with witnesses watching from multiple directions. Daniel hadn't moved from his position near the creek, but Eliza could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained steady on his rifle, despite the overwhelming odds he'd faced moments before. This was the soldier he'd been before life had knocked him down. Calm under pressure, tactically aware, dangerous when cornered. "Mr. Blackwood," Reverend Morrison called from the ridge, "I think it's time for you to consider the consequences of your actions. This confrontation is being witnessed by respectable members of the community, and word of what happens here will reach the territorial capital." The threat was subtle, but effective. New Mexico's path to statehood depended on demonstrating that the territory could maintain law and order. Range wars and armed conflicts reflected poorly on that goal, and territorial officials wouldn't appreciate local disputes that attracted federal attention. "This is a private matter," Blackwood replied, but his bluster was wearing thin. "Nothing's private when it involves a dozen armed men threatening a family on their own property," Jim Valdez said, his voice carrying the authority of a man respected throughout the valley. "Marcus, you've let this obsession with the McGraw place cloud your judgment. Time to back away before someone gets hurt." Eliza watched the dynamics shift as more of Blackwood's hired men began to look uncomfortable with the situation. These were cowboys and drifters, not soldiers or outlaws. They'd signed on for fence cutting and cattle rustling, not pitched battles with armed neighbors. But the man called Carson was different. Eliza could see it in his posture, the way he held his gun with professional familiarity. He was the kind of man who solved problems with violence and didn't much care about witnesses or consequences. "Boss," Carson said quietly, "we can still finish this. Take out Hart first, then deal with the others before they can organize." The words carried clearly in the morning air, and Eliza felt ice in her veins as she realized Carson was pushing for a fight that would likely end with people dead, including Daniel. "No," she called out, stepping down from the porch with the document still in her hand. "There's been enough violence already. Mr. Blackwood, you want this property so badly. Then make me an offer, a real offer for a legal sale." Daniel shot her a sharp look, but Eliza met his eyes steadily. She had a plan, and she needed him to trust her. "You said this was about business," she continued, walking slowly toward the group of riders. "Then let's conduct business. I'll sell you the water rights you want for fair market value. But the killing stops here." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "What's the catch?" "No catch. You pay me what the water rights are worth, let's say $5,000, and I'll deed over the creek frontage and the bottomland. Daniel and I keep the house and enough acreage for a small ranch." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline. It gave Blackwood most of what he wanted while allowing Eliza and Daniel to keep their home and their dignity. More importantly, it provided a way out of the confrontation that didn't require anyone to lose face or spill blood. But Carson wasn't interested in compromise. "This is a waste of time," he snarled, reaching for his gun. "Hart dies today, along with anyone else who—" The cavalry saber cleared its scabbard in one fluid motion, Daniel's military training taking over as Carson's hand moved toward his weapon. But it was Jim Valdez who fired first, his rifle shot echoing across the valley as Carson's gun flew from his hand. "That's enough," Valdez called out. "Next man who draws a weapon gets more than his hand shot." Carson clutched his bleeding fingers, his face twisted with pain and rage. "You'll pay for this, all of you." "No," Daniel said quietly, the saber still in his hand. "You will. Carson, isn't it? I know men like you from my army days. You're good at intimidating civilians, but you don't do so well when people shoot back." The Authority in Daniel's voice was unmistakable. This was a man who'd commanded soldiers in combat, who understood violence and how to control it. Cousin, despite his bluster, recognized a superior predator when he saw one. "Blackwood," Daniel continued, "take your hired gun and get off my property. Mrs. Hart's offer stands until sunset today. After that, you deal with whatever legal consequences come from today's events." Slowly, reluctantly, Blackwood signaled his men to withdraw. As they turned their horses and rode back down the valley, Eliza felt the tension leave her body like air from a punctured balloon. "Is it over?" she asked, moving to Daniel's side. "The immediate threat is over," he replied, sliding the saber back into its scabbard. "But men like Blackwood don't forget. We'll need to stay alert." Jim Valdez rode up to them, his weathered face creased with concern. "You folks did good today, but Daniel's right. This won't be the end of it unless Blackwood decides to take that offer you made." Eliza touched the rings at her throat again, feeling the weight of all they represented. "Then we'll be ready for whatever comes next. Together, as the neighbors." Dispersed and normal quiet returned to the valley. Eliza and Daniel stood together in their yard, looking at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. It was theirs now, truly and completely. But more importantly, they'd discovered that what they were really fighting for wasn't the property at all. It was each other. The newly planted garden stretched in neat rows before Eliza's kitchen window, its tender green shoots pushing through the rich, dark soil like promises of abundance to come. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Marcus Blackwood, and the McGraw homestead, now legally the Hart homestead, had been transformed from a struggling survival enterprise into something that felt genuinely like home. Daniel paused, in his work, repairing the chicken coop to watch his wife tend the garden. The morning sun caught the copper highlights in her hair as she bent to check the progress of the tomato seedlings, and something in her posture spoke of contentment in a way that still surprised him. The desperate, guarded woman who'd proposed. A marriage of convenience seemed like a memory from someone else's life. "The beans are coming along nicely," Eliza called to him, brushing soil from her hands. "We should have enough to can for winter, with plenty left over to trade in town." "And the corn? Better than I dared hope. Thomas always said this soil was too sandy for good corn, but apparently Thomas was wrong about a few things." The gentle criticism of her first husband carried no bitterness now. Eliza had made peace with Thomas's memory and his well-intentioned but misguided attempt to protect her through his will. She understood now that he'd acted from love, even if his actions had nearly cost her everything she held dear. Daniel set down his hammer and walked over to join her in the garden. The easy companionship between them had deepened over the months into something richer. Not just partnership or even affection, but the kind of bone-deep connection that made two people truly one family. "Speaking of things Thomas was wrong about," Daniel said, slipping his arms around Eliza from behind, "he seemed to think you couldn't manage this place alone." Eliza leaned back against his chest, enjoying the solid warmth of him. To be fair, he was probably right about that. But he couldn't have imagined I'd find someone willing to manage it with me. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look toward the track that led to their front gate. A single rider was coming up the valley. A woman by her silhouette, riding side saddle and leading a pack horse. "Expecting company?" Daniel asked. "Not that I know of." Eliza shaded her eyes against the morning sun, trying to make out details of their visitor. "Wait, I think that might be Mary Hart." Daniel's sister-in-law had been corresponding with them regularly since they'd sent money to help her through the winter crisis. Her letters had grown increasingly confident over the months, describing her successful efforts to keep the farm running and her children's adjustment to life without their father. As the rider drew closer, Daniel could see that it was indeed Mary, though she looked very different from the desperate widow he remembered. She sat her horse with confidence, her dress practical but well-made, and her face carried none of the hollow-eyed desperation that had marked their last meeting. "Daniel! Eliza!" Mary called out as she approached the house. "I hope you don't mind an unexpected visitor." They hurried to greet her, helping her down from her horse and leading her toward the house. Daniel could see immediately that Mary had prospered since their last communication. Her clothes were new, her horse was good quality, and she carried herself like a woman who'd found her footing in the world. "Mary, what brings you all this way?" Daniel asked as they settled on the front porch with glasses of cool water. "Several things," Mary replied, her smile bright and genuine. "First, I wanted to thank you both in person for the help you sent. That money made all the difference during the hardest months." "How are the children?" Eliza asked. "Thriving. Little Sarah's grown 3 inches and learned to read. The boys are helping with the farm work and talking about maybe going to school in town come fall." Mary's pride in her children was evident. "But the real news is that I've decided to sell the farm and move west." Daniel felt a moment of concern. "Mary, if you're having troubles again—" "No troubles at all," she interrupted with a laugh. "Quite the opposite. I've had 3 offers for the property, all above what Jonathan paid for it originally. Turns out the railroad's coming through, and farmland near the proposed route is suddenly very valuable." Eliza and Daniel exchanged pleased glances. Mary's financial security had been a constant worry for both of them. "So what's your plan?" Eliza asked. "I'm moving to California. My sister lives in Sacramento, and she says there are opportunities there for a woman with farming experience and enough capital to start fresh." Mary's eyes sparkled with excitement. "The children are eager for the adventure, and I think a new start somewhere with no sad memories might be exactly what we all need." They spent the afternoon catching up, sharing stories of their respective new lives. Mary marveled at the transformation of the homestead and the obvious contentment between Daniel and Eliza. "You two seem genuinely happy," she observed as they prepared dinner together. "I remember Daniel's letter saying this was a practical arrangement, but this doesn't look very practical to me." Eliza smiled, glancing at her husband as he played with the kitten they'd recently acquired. "It started practical, but practical arrangements sometimes grow into something more when the right people are involved." "Are you planning to expand your family?" Mary asked gently. "We're hopeful," Daniel replied, rejoining the conversation. "Nothing definite yet, but we're not opposed to the possibility." That evening, as they sat around the fire sharing stories and planning Mary's journey west, Eliza reflected on how much had changed since that desperate morning when she'd proposed marriage to a stranger. She'd been looking for survival then, someone to help her hold on to the only life she knew. Instead, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was missing: a true partner, someone who made her stronger while allowing her to do the same for him. The practical arrangement had become the kind of love that didn't announce itself with grand gestures, but revealed itself in daily kindnesses, shared work, and the quiet comfort of knowing someone would always be there. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, noticing her contemplative mood. Eliza looked around at their home, the house they'd rebuilt together, the land they'd fought to keep, the garden they'd planted with hope for the future. But most of all, she looked at the people who shared it with her. Daniel, whose steady presence had become as essential as breathing, and Mary, whose visit reminded her that family wasn't just about blood, but about the people who chose to stand by you when times were hard. "I'm thinking," she said, reaching for Daniel's hand, "that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as necessity, and sometimes the love you need isn't the love you expected, but it's exactly the love you were meant to have." Daniel squeezed her fingers gently, understanding perfectly. They'd both come to this place broken and desperate, looking for practical solutions to immediate problems. Instead, they'd found something neither had dared hope for: a second chance at happiness, built on foundations strong enough to last a lifetime. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Inside, by the warmth of their own fire, Eliza and Daniel Hart planned their future together with the quiet confidence of people who'd learned that the best partnerships are built not on passion alone, but on the deeper satisfactions of mutual respect, shared purpose and love that grows stronger with each passing day.